The rumbling was supposed to be the answer to everything. 100 years of suffering, of living behind walls, of watching people die in vertical gear and call it heroism, of an entire civilization deciding that the only way to survive was to threaten the rest of the world with extinction. And Eren Yeager had set it all in motion with the full weight of his conviction and his grief and his rage. Millions of wall titans marching toward every shore, every city, every living thing outside Paradise. An apocalypse so complete and so deliberate that the only beings capable of stopping it were a handful of people who used to be his friends, flying toward him on a boat with the specific exhausted desperation of people who have run out of every option, except the one they hoped they would never have to use. And even then, even with the combined strength of every power that remained, the math didn't work, the numbers didn't add up. The war was going to end the way it was always going to end. With most of the world already gone, and the people still fighting, wondering whether any version of winning was actually survivable. And then something happened that the history of Paradise, of Marley, of every nation that had ever lived in fear of the Titans had absolutely no framework to prepare for, which was the arrival of a man who looked at the largest military force in the history of human civilization and felt, primarily, inconvenienced. If you've ever watched Attack on Titan and felt the specific suffocating weight of a story where every victory costs everything, and every plan fails halfway, and every character you love is one episode away from being gone, and you've ever wanted, just once, to see something walk into that world that the world simply could not touch. Something that looked at the rumbling and the founding Titan and 100 years of inherited tragedy, and resolved all of it not with sacrifice or strategy, or the kind of heroism that breaks the hero in the process. Then this is the video you've been waiting for. Because what happens when Saitama arrives in the world of Attack on Titan isn't just a power fantasy. It's the collision of two of the most thematically heavy universes in anime history, and only one of them has any idea what's coming. Like the video, subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. To understand why Saitama arriving in the world of Attack on Titan is not just a crossover, but a complete categorical dismantling of everything that world is built on, you have to first understand what the world of Attack on Titan actually is at its core. Not the plot, not the characters, not the specific mechanics of Titan shifting and the power of the Titans and the history of Emir Fritz, but the fundamental emotional and philosophical architecture of the thing. The underlying principle that governs how this world works and what it costs to survive in it. Because that principle is the thing that Saitama's existence most directly and most completely contradicts. And the contradiction is so total that it doesn't just change the outcome of the rumbling, it changes the meaning of everything that led to it. The world of Attack on Titan is a world where power has a price, always, without exception. And the price is always paid in the currency of human suffering. The Titans themselves are a manifestation of this. Human beings transformed into something monstrous, stripped of their agency and their identity and their capacity for ordinary life, turned into weapons by forces they didn't choose and couldn't resist. Their existence a continuous expression of the idea that power in this world is never clean, never free, never something you simply have without it costing you something essential. The Titan shifters pay with their lives, 13 years, the curse of Emir, a countdown built into the very nature of the power that makes them extraordinary, ensuring that whoever wields the founding Titan or the Attack Titan or any of the 9 is always, simultaneously, dying from the wielding of it. The soldiers of the Survey Corps pay with their lives in the more immediate and brutal sense, dying in vertical gear in the mouths of creatures they can barely comprehend. And the ones who survive pay with the specific psychological damage of having survived when others didn't, of carrying the weight of every person they watched die and couldn't save. Eren Yeager paid with everything. With his mother, with his innocence, with his ability to trust, with his relationships, with his capacity for ordinary human feeling, with the version of himself that had wanted to be free in a simple and straightforward sense. free to see the ocean, free to live outside the walls, free in the way a child means free before they understand what freedom actually costs, and eventually with his own life. Though by the time he reached the end of his path, the version of himself that died was so far removed from the child, who had made the original choice, that calling it a sacrifice implies a continuity of self that may not have been there anymore. He inherited the founding Titan and the attack Titan, and the memories of every holder before him, and he used all of that to set the rumbling in motion, to wake the millions of wall titans that had been sleeping inside the walls of Parades for a century and send them marching toward the rest of the world. And the logic of the thing, the brutal, terrible, internally consistent logic, was that this was the only way, that the world would never stop having Eldians, that the cycle of violence would continue until someone broke it by making the alternative to peace so catastrophic that peace became the only option left. He was probably right about the logic, which is the most disturbing thing about it. The world of Attack on Titan does not give you a version of Eren's plan where the logic is obviously flawed. It gives you a version where the logic works, where the history supports the conclusion, where every alternative that the other characters can propose falls apart under examination, because the world is designed to be a place where clean solutions don't exist, where the best available option is always still terrible, where heroism is defined not by finding the right answer, but by choosing the least wrong one and living, if you survive at all, with the weight of having chosen it. The rumbling, at the point where this story diverges from the canon, is already in progress. The wall titans have been walking for days, their footsteps reshaping the geography of every coast they reach, their bodies massive enough that the ground itself responds to their passage with something that registers on instruments as seismic activity, their path through Marley leaving behind a flattened silence that used to be cities and ports, and the ordinary infrastructure of a civilization that had existed for generations, and was now simply gone, converted into the specific flat absence that is what remains when something of sufficient size passes over something that was not built to withstand it. The population of Marley that had not managed to flee was gone. The military installations that Marley had built over decades of accumulating power were gone. The ports that had launched the Marleyan military across oceans to attack Parades were gone, which had a specific irony that nobody in a position to appreciate it was in a position to appreciate it. The allied forces, Marleyans and Eldians who had chosen to fight together against the rumbling, against Eren, against the logic of a solution that required the death of most of humanity to implement, were pursuing on airships and on the ground, and on a ship that was moving as fast as it could move toward a confrontation that the people on it understood on some level was probably not survivable, but was the only thing left to do. Armin was on that ship. Mikasa was on that ship. Ryunur, who had more reason than almost anyone to simply let the rumbling happen and was there anyway, was on that ship. Jean, Connie, Historia's forces, the surviving Titan shifters, everyone who remained was converging on a point that Eren was also converging on, from the center of an army of millions, toward the coast of a continent that was in the process of being erased, toward an ending that the narrative had been building toward for years with the specific, grinding, accumulating inevitability of something that was never going to resolve cleanly. And somewhere in the space between universes, in the unmapped territory where the boundaries between one reality and another are thinner than the mathematics of any single universe can account for, a crack opened. It was small, smaller than the ones that dimensional travel in other stories tends to produce, without the dramatic visual signature of a portal or a breach or a tear rendered in CGI light. Just a quiet discontinuity in the fabric of the air above the Titan-flattened plains of what used to be a mid-sized Marleyan city, a shimmer that lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then deposited onto the rubble-strewn ground below, a man in a yellow jumpsuit who landed boots first in a small impact crater, and looked around at the flattened ruins of a civilization with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and is taking a moment to assess the situation before deciding how to feel about it. Saitama looked left. He looked right. He looked at the flat, featureless horizon where buildings used to be. He looked up at the sky, which had the specific quality of a sky above a place where a lot of dust has recently been displaced, hazy, brownish at the edges, carrying the atmospheric aftermath of catastrophe, the way a room carries smoke after a fire. He looked down at his boots, which had landed in something he preferred not to identify, and he shifted his weight slightly to the left. "Huh," he said, to no one, with the specific intonation of a man who has arrived at the wrong stop, but is reserving judgment on whether this constitutes a problem until he has more information. In the distance, so large that they registered first as a feature of the landscape rather than as individual objects, the wall titans moved. The wall titans were not creatures in any sense that the word creature was normally meant to convey, because creature implied a thing that had originated as a living being and had been changed into something else. And while that was technically accurate in the biological and historical sense, every wall titan had once been a human being, an Eldian whose body had been converted by the power of the founding titan into something massive and structural and purposeful. Packed into the walls of parodies for a century like bricks made of compressed tragedy, the word creature suggested something with agency, something that moved according to its own will and its own hunger, something that could be communicated with or fled from or understood in the way you understand an animal by learning its patterns and its instincts and the logic of its behavior. The wall titans had none of that. They were instruments, extensions of a single will operating through the founding titan's connection to every Eldian body that had ever been converted, and they moved with the specific, terrible, mechanical uniformity of something that has been given one instruction and has no capacity to receive any other, which was to walk, and to keep walking, and to flatten everything in the path of the walking until the walking was done. Each one was approximately 50 meters tall, which is a number that reads on a page as a measurement and registers in person, as an alteration of the relationship between a human body and the sky above it. The specific cognitive disruption of standing in the presence of something so large that your depth perception stops working correctly, and your sense of scale, which you have been calibrating against the world your entire life, simply gives up and defers to something more primal than measurement. Which is the understanding that this thing is too big, that the category of things you know how to respond to does not contain this, that whatever happens next is going to be determined entirely by forces that your presence in the situation cannot meaningfully influence. They moved in formation so dense that from a distance they looked less like individual beings and more like a single continuous surface, a wall of flesh and bone and titan biology advancing across the landscape with a patience that was more geological than animal. The patience of something that does not experience the passage of time as urgency because time, in the context of what it is doing, is simply the medium through which the doing occurs. Saitama looked at them for approximately 4 seconds. This was not the 4 seconds of a person processing shock or fear, or the specific cognitive overload of encountering something that falls outside every prior category of experience. It was the 4 seconds of a person performing an assessment, running through the available information, and arriving at a conclusion, which in this case appeared to be that the things on the horizon were very large, that they were moving, and that they were moving in a direction that included his current location in its eventual path. He tilted his head slightly to the left, which was his characteristic gesture of mild engagement, the physical expression of something registering as at least marginally more interesting than the baseline. And then he began walking toward them, not running, not moving with any particular urgency, just walking with the unhurried, slightly meandering pace of a person crossing a parking lot toward a destination that will still be there when they arrive. The Allied Forces airships were the first to see him. They were flying at an altitude that gave them a view of the battlefield that ground-level observers couldn't access, and from that altitude, The wall titans were a moving carpet of massive bodies stretching to the horizon in every direction, and the flattened ruins of Marleyan cities were a pattern of geometric absence in the landscape. And moving through that landscape was a single small figure in yellow that the airship crews initially cataloged as a survivor, a civilian who had somehow failed to evacuate. Now walking directly toward the advancing Titans with the specific directional confidence of someone who either didn't understand what they were walking toward or had decided that understanding it was not relevant to their plans. Flock, had he still been alive in this divergent timeline, would have ordered them ignored. The surviving commanders of the aligned forces had more immediate problems than one survivor walking the wrong direction, and they were already calculating angles of approach and coordinating the Titan shifters and managing the logistics of an assault on a target that had approximately 1,000,000-to-1 numerical advantage over everything they had available, which left very little bandwidth for monitoring a single yellow figure on the ground below. Armin was watching through binoculars from the deck of the airship he was coordinating from, because Armin always watched and always noticed, and always processed what he noticed with more layers of analysis than most people applied to things that were directly affecting them. And he noticed the figure, and he watched it for longer than the tactical situation strictly warranted. Because something about the way it moved didn't fit the category of survivor, and didn't fit the category of soldier, and didn't fit any category he had available. And Armin had learned, through years of operating in situations where the thing that didn't fit the available categories turned out to be the thing that mattered most, to pay attention to exactly that quality of not fitting. The first wall titan to reach Saitama's position was not the nearest one. The formation was dense enough that the spacing between individuals was irregular, and the nearest one passed perhaps 200 meters to his left, its footstep landing close enough that the impact displacement of air reached him as a physical pressure, the way the passage of a very large vehicle on a highway reaches a pedestrian on the sidewalk as wind and sound and vibration rather than direct contact. Saitama stopped walking and looked up at it as it passed, had to tilt his head back considerably, which was a gesture he didn't usually have to perform for anything, and watched it go by with the expression of someone observing something genuinely large for the first time, and taking a moment to appreciate the scale before deciding what to do about it. Then he looked ahead at the formation, at the density of bodies moving in every direction, at the scale of what the rumbling actually was when you were standing inside it rather than observing it from a strategic distance. And something moved through his expression that was not quite decision and not quite intent, but was in the general territory of both, the specific settling of a person who has assessed a situation and arrived at the point where assessment ends and action begins. He jumped. The jump was not a dramatic, powered leap with visual wind effects and a trailing cape. It was simply a jump, the same jump he always made, which happened to carry him upward at a velocity, and to an altitude that had no natural analog in any physics that the world of Attack on Titan operated under, clearing the height of the nearest wall Titan in approximately the time it takes to blink. Continuing upward until he was above the entire formation, and could see it spread below him like a map of something that had stopped being a military force and started being a geographical feature. Millions of identical massive bodies moving in coordinated silence toward a horizon that still had things on it that were scheduled to be flattened. He hung at the apex of the jump for a moment, suspended above the rumbling with the specific stillness of something that has temporarily escaped the jurisdiction of gravity and hasn't decided yet to return to it. And he looked down at what he was looking at with the expression he wore when something had finally, against reasonable expectation, gotten large enough or strange enough or sufficiently outside his normal frame of reference to register as actually interesting, which was an expression that most people in his universe never got to see because most things in his universe were not large enough or strange enough to produce it. Below him, the wall titans moved. Around him, The airships of the Allied forces moved in their tactical formations. And on one of those airships, Armin Arlert had lowered his binoculars and was staring at the yellow figure suspended above the rumbling at an altitude that no vertical maneuvering gear could reach, and no Titan shifter transformation had ever achieved through a simple jump. And his face had the specific expression it got when his model of the possible was being revised in real time, the careful, precise, slightly alarmed attention of a strategist watching a new variable enter the board and trying to calculate, before he had nearly enough information to do so, what category to file it in. Saitama landed. He landed in the middle of the wall Titan formation, dropping straight down from the apex of the jump with his fist already drawn back, not because he had made a considered tactical decision to deploy a downward punch as his opening move, but because that was simply what felt appropriate, what the situation seemed to call for in the same intuitive way that certain situations call for certain responses before conscious deliberation has fully caught up with the assessment. And his fist hit the ground at the center of a cluster of wall titans, with the specific lack of ceremony of a man who has hit things so many times that the act itself has become entirely routine. And the impact produced a shockwave that radiated outward from the impact point in a perfect circle. And every wall titan within approximately 300 meters of the impact point was lifted off the ground by the shockwave and thrown outward from the center like objects knocked off a table. And they did not get up. 300 meters of wall titans, eliminated, in the time it takes to fall from a jump and complete a punch, without Saitama's expression changing in any meaningful way from the mild, checking expression of someone who has just done something and is assessing whether it achieved the intended result. He looked at the cleared circle around him. He looked at the formation continuing to advance from beyond the cleared area. He looked at his fist, then at the formation, then at his fist again in the specific evaluative way of someone running a quick calculation. And the calculation was apparently simple enough that it didn't take long, because he drew back his fist again almost immediately, with the air of someone settling into a task that is going to take a while, but is not, fundamentally, a difficult one. On the airship above, Armin watched the circle of cleared titans and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, very quietly to no one in particular, "What is that?" It was not a question. It was the verbal expression of a category failing to load, the specific sound a mind makes when it has encountered something that it cannot file anywhere and has not yet decided what to do about that. Mikasa, standing beside him, was watching with a different quality of attention, less analytical, more direct, the watching of someone who has spent years calibrating their sense of what a fighter looks like and what a fighter does, and is currently watching something that fits the shape of a fighter without fitting any of the parameters, someone who hits things the way she hits things but without the cost, without the three-dimensional maneuvering and the gas canisters and the precisely angled blades and the years of training that made those blades mean something, without any of the infrastructure of survival that she had built her entire existence around, hitting them and having them go away, and moving immediately to the next one with the specific calm of a person doing a thing that is not, for them, a crisis. "I don't know," she said, which was the most honest answer available and the one she was least accustomed to giving. There is a specific quality to the way that overwhelming force moves through resistance, and it is different from what most stories about overwhelming force tend to depict, because most stories about overwhelming force are actually stories about the experience of the people observing it, the terror and awe of watching something move through obstacles that should stop it and don't. And they render that experience in slow motion and dramatic framing and musical swells that communicate to the audience that what they are watching is significant and rare and worthy of the weight the story is placing on it. The actual movement of overwhelming force through resistance is not like that. It is, in its essential nature, boring. Not boring in the sense of being unimportant, but boring in the sense of being repetitive and mechanical, and without the dramatic variation that makes things feel eventful. The same action producing the same result again and again with the same efficiency and the same absence of complication. A process rather than a performance. Something that looks less like combat and more like work of a very specific and very physical kind. The kind of work that gets done by something that has no reason to be theatrical about it, because theatricality implies an audience whose reaction matters. And for Saitama, no audience's reaction had mattered for a very long time. He moved through the wall titan formation the way weather moves through a landscape, not targeting, not strategizing, not making the micro-level decisions about angle and force and timing that defined every other fighter who had ever operated in this world, but simply advancing in a direction and removing whatever was in the path of the advancing, each removal accomplished with whatever level of force the obstacle presented happened to call for, which in the case of wall titans turned out to be considerably less force than Saitama had deployed against most things he had encountered in his own universe, a fact that registered to him not as reassurance or pride, but simply as information, the way a carpenter notes that a particular wood is softer than expected, useful data, no particular emotional valence attached to it. Each punch cleared a radius. Each cleared radius was followed by several steps forward and another punch, and the geometry of the thing was almost mathematical in its regularity, circles of absence appearing in the wall titan formation at consistent intervals as Saitama moved through it, the formation closing behind him where it could and thinning ahead of him where it couldn't. The overall effect from an aerial view being the image of a single point of yellow moving through a field of massive bodies, and leaving behind it a trail of stillness that the formation was not replenishing fast enough to fill in, because the formation's logic was forward motion, and its programming, if you could call it that, did not include a subroutine for what to do when something was moving through it from the inside. Reiner Braun, in his armored Titan form, had been operating on the flank of the Allied forces' assault, when the radio communications from the airships started carrying reports that he initially processed as the product of observer error or equipment malfunction, because the reports were describing something that his model of the battlefield could not accommodate, and his instinct was therefore to assume the model was correct and the reports were wrong, which is the instinct of every experienced military mind when incoming information contradicts established expectations, and it is an instinct that serves you well right up until the moment when the incoming information is accurate and the established expectations are the thing that needs updating. He shifted to a higher position to get a visual on what the airship crews were reporting, and he got the visual, and the visual did not resolve the contradiction between the reports and his expectations. It simply transferred the contradiction from the category of things he was hearing to the category of things he was seeing with his own eyes, which made it harder to dismiss but no easier to explain. A human-sized figure in yellow was moving through the wall titan formation, and the wall titans were going down around it. Not being evaded, not being outmaneuvered or strategically avoided in the way that vertical maneuvering gear allowed Survey Corps soldiers to navigate around Titans by exploiting the gap between Titan size and Titan agility. But going down, physically, the contact between the yellow figure and each Titan resulting in the Titan's removal from the formation in a way that Reiner's eyes kept trying to categorize as something other than what it was. Kept trying to file as an explosion or a weapon's discharge or some kind of ordnance he wasn't familiar with, because the alternative, that a human-sized figure was hitting 50-meter Titans hard enough to knock them out of a formation through direct physical contact, was a category that his entire experience of what human beings were and what Titans were, and how the relationship between those two things worked did not have space for. He watched for 30 seconds, which was long enough to eliminate every alternative explanation his mind was generating and leave him with only the one that didn't fit, and then he got on the radio and said, in the specific flat voice of a person delivering information, they do not fully believe but can no longer responsibly withhold. There is something in the formation, human-sized. He paused, because even having committed to delivering the information, he was still having difficulty assembling it into a sentence that didn't sound like the output of a mind that had started malfunctioning. And then he finished the sentence the only way it could be finished accurately, which was, "It's punching them. And they're going down." The radio silence that followed this report lasted approximately 4 seconds, which in a coordinated military operation is a significant silence. The silence of multiple people simultaneously encountering the same category failure, and none of them having a resolution for it fast enough to break the silence first. Eren Yeager, the Beast Titan, had a different relationship to the information than Eren did, because Zeke's relationship to everything was filtered through a layer of intellectual detachment that he had cultivated as a survival mechanism, and that had over time become genuinely characteristic of how he processed the world. At a remove, with the specific quality of attention of someone who finds things interesting rather than threatening, who catalogs rather than reacts, who responds to the unexpected by moving toward analysis rather than away from danger. He had seen enough of the world's capacity for surprise that his threshold for genuine astonishment was very high, and it had been a long time since anything had cleared it. He looked at the reports from the airships, and he looked at the visual confirmation from Riener's position, and he assembled the available data into a picture, and the picture that assembled itself was one that cleared his threshold for astonishment not by a little, but by a margin that he would not have considered achievable before this moment. He transformed. The Beast Titan's form was massive even by Titan standards, taller than most, with the distinctive ape-like proportions that made it both recognizable and deeply unsettling to anyone who had encountered it before. Its throwing arm capable of launching projectiles with enough force and precision to destroy airships from a distance, which had been its primary tactical application in the wars it had participated in. Zeke inside the Beast Titan was a weapons platform disguised as a monster, and he had used it with the cold precision of someone who thought of combat as a problem in applied mathematics, each projectile calculated for trajectory and impact, each engagement planned for efficiency rather than spectacle. He reached down and gathered a mass of rubble from the flattened ruins around him, the compressed remains of Marleyan infrastructure, stone and steel and concrete, fused by the passage of wall titans into irregular shapes that were approximately the right density for his purposes, and he threw it. The throw was aimed with his characteristic precision, a ballistic arc calculated to intersect with the position of the yellow figure in the formation at the moment of impact, accounting for the figure's rate of movement and direction, the kind of throw that had previously ended airships and broken defensive lines, and demonstrated conclusively why the Beast Titan was considered one of the most dangerous ranged combatants in the world of Attack on Titan. The rubble mass hit Saitama. There was no ambiguity about the hit. The trajectory was accurate and the timing was right, and the mass connected with the yellow figure and produced the kind of impact that should have been, by every physical standard that the world of Attack on Titan operated under, conclusive. The dust from the impact spread outward in a cloud that briefly obscured the position, and Zeke watched the cloud with the careful attention of someone waiting for the confirmation that the problem had been resolved, the specific focused waiting of a chess player who has made their move and is watching the board to see how the position changes. The dust settled. Saitama was standing where he had been standing. He was looking up at the Beast Titan with the expression of someone who has just been hit by something and is in the process of determining what it was and where it came from, not because the hit had caused any particular sensation that required investigation, but out of the simple curiosity of someone who has noticed that something happened and wants to understand the mechanism, the way you might look around after walking through a spider web, not hurt, but interested in locating the source. He found the source. He looked at the Beast Titan with the specific evaluative attention. he applied to things that had done something that caught his notice, running the quick internal assessment of a person who has been, in the most technical sense possible, engaged, not threatened, not challenged in any way that registered as meaningful, but engaged, which was a category distinction that mattered enormously to Saitama, and very little to anyone who hadn't spent years in the particular kind of loneliness that came from being so strong that nothing could reach you. Zeke, inside the Beast Titan, watching the yellow figure look up at him with what appeared to be mild interest after absorbing a throw that had been calculated to be conclusive, felt his analytical framework experience something it was not designed to accommodate, which was the complete absence of a next calculation, the specific blankness of a system that has reached the end of its decision tree without finding a branch that led anywhere useful. Saitama bent his knees. He looked up at the Beast Titan with something in his expression that might, in the right light, have been the very early and very tentative beginning of engagement. Not excitement, not the full-spectrum thrill of a fight that might genuinely go either way, but the distant cousin of that feeling, the faint signal of something that registered as more than nothing, which in the context of Saitama's internal experience was a meaningful distinction, even if it would have been invisible to most observers. He jumped toward the Beast Titan, and the distance between them, which Zeke had chosen specifically to maintain the tactical advantage of his throwing range, closed in a time interval that had no natural analog in anything the world of Attack on Titan had produced, and Yeager, watching from his position, processed what he was seeing with the specific quality of mind that very experienced fighters develop, which is the ability to read a physical exchange and understand its outcome before it completes. And what he read in the arc of Saitama's jump and the trajectory of his fist and the complete absence of any evasive movement from the Beast Titan, not because Zeke had chosen not to evade, but because the interval between the jump and the arrival was shorter than the neural processing time required to begin an evasive response, was an outcome that he understood completely and could not do anything about. The punch landed in the center of the Beast Titan's chest with a sound that the Allied forces heard from 3 kilometers away, and that the Wall Titans, who had no capacity to hear anything or respond to anything except the founding Titan's directive, continued walking through without alteration. Zeke's Titan form cracked, not the localized damage of a well-placed blade strike to the nape, the precise surgical intervention that Titan killing required in this world, but structural cracking, the kind that started at the point of impact and radiated outward through the Titan's body in lines that followed the architecture of the form itself. And the Beast Titan sat down, heavily, in the rubble of a flattened city, with the specific quality of sitting that was less a choice than a consequence. And Zeke inside it was alive. The Titan's healing would see to that. But the Beast Titan itself was going to be non-functional for longer than the battle had remaining time to accommodate. Saitama landed, looked at the sitting Beast Titan, looked back at the Wall Titan formation that was continuing its advance around and past this exchange as if it hadn't happened, and then looked at the Allied forces' airships overhead, apparently noticing them properly for the first time, or at least noticing them with sufficient attention to register that they contained people, and the people appeared to be watching him. And some of them appeared to be trying to communicate with him through methods he couldn't access from his current position. He waved. It was a small wave, the wave of someone acknowledging that they have been seen without being entirely sure what the appropriate social protocol for the current situation was. A gesture that was so ordinary and so human and so completely mismatched with everything surrounding it that Armin Arlert, watching from the airship, felt the specific cognitive dissonance of a mind encountering 2 things simultaneously that could not both be true. The evidence of what this figure had just done to the Beast Titan, and the armored Titans' reported exchanges and several hundred Wall Titans, and the small, slightly awkward wave of someone who wasn't sure if waving was the right call but had decided to do it anyway. "We need to talk to it," Armin said, and his voice had the quality it got when he had made a decision faster than the reasoning behind it had fully assembled, when the conclusion had arrived before the argument, and he was committing to the conclusion while the argument caught up. Lower an airship. Now. Armin Arlert had built his entire identity around the idea that intelligence was a weapon, that the right application of understanding and analysis, and the willingness to think further ahead than anyone else in the room, could compensate for the physical limitations that had always made him the weakest person in any group he was part of. And this idea had been proven correct enough times, in enough high-stakes situations, that it had stopped being a belief and had become something closer to a foundational truth, not something he thought about anymore, but something he operated from, the floor beneath every decision he made and every risk he took, and every sacrifice he rationalized as necessary for the larger plan. He had talked his way out of execution. He had talked Berthold into hesitation at a critical moment. He had conceived the plan that retook Trost, and the plan that trapped the female Titan, and the plan at the port that had cost him more than he had wanted to pay, and that he was still, in the quiet moments, still paying for. Thinking was what he did. Understanding was what he offered. It was the only thing he had ever had that was entirely his own. He descended to Saitama's level on a lowered platform from the airship, because the airship itself couldn't land in the rubble-strewn terrain without risking structural damage, and he stood on the platform as it was lowered, and he looked at the yellow figure standing in the middle of the flattened ruins of what had been a Marleyan city, and he tried to apply the same analytical process he applied to everything, which was to gather the available information and construct a model, and use the model to generate a strategy. And the process stalled almost immediately because the available information refused to cohere into a model that made sense within any framework he had available. He knew what he had seen. He had seen this figure move through wall titans the way Survey Corps soldiers move through tall grass, not avoiding them, not outmaneuvering them, but simply removing them from the path of the movement with a consistency and an efficiency and an apparent absence of cost that violated every principle of combat he had ever learned or observed or theorized about. Because combat in his world always had a cost, always. The cost was the axiom from which everything else derived. And what he had watched from the airship was combat without cost, strength without payment, power exercised without the simultaneous diminishment of the one exercising it. And his mind kept trying to find the cost he was missing, kept insisting that it must be there somewhere, invisible from his vantage point but present, because a world without that cost was not the world he had been living in for the past several years, and he was not yet ready to revise his model of the world that completely. Saitama looked up at the platform, descending toward him, and waited for it to arrive with the patient, unhurried stillness of someone who has nowhere specific to be, and is therefore content to let things happen at their own pace. When the platform reached a height he could reasonably converse with, he looked at Armin with the open, uncomplicated attention of someone encountering a new person, and not yet having formed an opinion about them, which in Saitama's case was an expression almost indistinguishable from his baseline expression of mild vacancy, but which was, for someone who knew what to look for, subtly different, more present, more directed. The attention of someone who is actually looking rather than simply facing in a direction. "Are you the one in charge of those?" Saitama asked, gesturing broadly at the wall titan formation still advancing around them, and the question was so direct and so stripped of any of the contextual scaffolding that Armin had been preparing to navigate that it took him a moment to process it, because he had been anticipating something more difficult, a language barrier, a hostile response, incomprehensibility of some kind, and the simple directness of the question landed in a space he hadn't prepared. "No," Armin said carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that every word in an exchange with an unknown powerful being was potentially load-bearing. "We're trying to stop them. We're trying to stop the person who is in charge of them." He paused, watching Saitama's face for the response to that information, cataloging the data the response provided. "You've been helping, I think. What you've been doing to the Titans." He gestured at the cleared areas in the formation. That helps us." Saitama looked at the cleared areas, then back at Armin, with the expression of someone being given credit for something they did as an aside, and are mildly uncertain how to receive the credit. "I was just trying to figure out where I was," he said, which was true in the specific way that Saitama's statements were always true, which was completely and without any of the self-presentation that most people layered over their truthful statements to make them land more impressively. He had been figuring out where he was, and the wall Titans had been in the way of the figuring out, and removing them had been the most straightforward solution to that particular logistical problem. Armin looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating, adjusting the parameters of the model in real time to accommodate new input. "Can you keep doing it?" he asked. "Stopping the Titans. Can you keep," he searched for the right verb and settled on the honest one, "doing what you were doing?" "Probably," Saitama said, with the specific qualifier of someone who doesn't like to overclaim, but also doesn't have a genuine reason to doubt the answer. The verbal equivalent of a shrug that acknowledges certainty without performing it. What neither of them knew, in the specific moment of that exchange, was that the conversation was being observed. Not by the Allied forces on the airships above, though they were watching, but by Eren, through the founding Titan's connection to every Titan and every Eldian body that it was linked to. The vast and terrible omniscience of the coordinate that gave him access not just to the wall Titans, but to the sensory information of every Titan shifter on the battlefield, which meant that through Rhaenyr's senses, and through the recovering awareness of Zeke's beast Titan form, Eren had been watching Saitama since the first cleared circle had appeared in the wall Titan formation, had been watching with the specific quality of attention that Eren Yeager brought to things that interfered with his plan, which was the burning, focused, completely committed attention of a person who has sacrificed everything for a single outcome, and experiences anything that threatens that outcome not as an obstacle to be evaluated, but as something to be removed. He had felt Saitama's punches through the Titan connection, not in the way that pain traveled through it, not as a sensory experience, but as an informational one, each cleared circle registering in the coordinate as an absence where presence had been, a gap in the formation that the founding Titan's awareness cataloged automatically, and the accumulation of those gaps had a shape that Eren recognized as directional, intentional. Moving through his army toward the center of the rumbling, with the specific patience of something that was not hurrying, because it did not need to hurry. He understood, with the clarity that the founding Titan's awareness provided, that this was not a weapon the Allied forces had deployed, was not something that Hange or Armin or anyone on those airships had planned or anticipated or was in any meaningful sense controlling, and the absence of a controlling intelligence behind it made it more difficult to address rather than less, because you could negotiate with a controlling intelligence or outmaneuver it or cut off its access to the asset it was controlling. And none of those options were available when the asset appeared to be operating on its own assessment of the situation. He shifted forms. The founding Titan was enormous even by the standards of a world that had been living with Titans for a century. The skeletal, towering, impossibly large form that Eren had become when he triggered the rumbling, its spine extending for kilometers behind it, its ribcage alone large enough to contain structures that most civilizations would have called buildings, its presence in the landscape less like a creature and more like a feature of the terrain, something that existed at the scale of geography rather than biology. It moved towards Saitama's position with the specific, deliberate intention of something that has identified a problem and is applying itself to the problem directly, and the wall Titans around it shifted their formation in response to its movement, adjusting their paths to accommodate the passage of the form that was directing them, a ripple of coordinated adjustment moving through the formation like a current through water. Armin saw it coming from the airship and felt the bottom drop out of his assessment of the situation, because his assessment had been building toward a possibility, still fragile, still dependent on variables he couldn't control, but present, that this yellow figure might be usable, might be the variable that changed the math of an engagement that the math had never favored. And now Eren was moving directly toward that variable with the full weight of the founding titan behind him. And the timeline for the possibility Armin had been building toward had just compressed from something he could work with to something that was already happening without his input. Saitama looked at the founding titan approaching. He looked at it for longer than he had looked at the wall titans, because the wall titans were large in the way that an obstacle is large enough to require engagement, not large enough to require recalibration of his sense of scale. And the founding titan was large in a different way, large in the way that makes the brain reach for different comparisons, large enough that his visual field couldn't contain it without stepping back. Large enough that the shadow it cast reached him before it did, and the shadow itself was a kind of weather, a change in the quality of the light and the temperature of the air. He stepped back, not from fear. The word fear had stopped being applicable to Saitama's physical experience so long ago that it had become more of a historical concept than a present one, but from the simple practical necessity of fitting the thing he was looking at into his field of vision, the way you step back from a very large painting in a museum, not because the painting is threatening, but because you need the distance to see what it actually is. What it actually was, from the distance that allowed him to see it, was very big and moving with purpose, and this registered to him with a delay, because it was a quality that required more contextual knowledge than he currently had to recognize immediately: angry. Not in the way that monsters in his own world were angry, which was the reflexive aggression of things that operated on instinct and registered threats as stimuli to be responded to, but in the way that people were angry, the directed, specific, personal anger of someone who has something important at stake and is watching it be interfered with. And Saitama, who had encountered very few things in his existence that were angry at him in the personal rather than the instinctive sense, registered the distinction with something that was in the neighborhood of curiosity. The founding titan reached for him. The hand that reached was the size of a neighborhood, each finger longer than a city block, and it descended toward Saitama's position with the slow, inexorable quality of something that didn't need to be fast because fast was a concept that applied to things that could be evaded, and the logic of something that large reaching for something that small was that evasion was not a realistic option, that the spatial mathematics of the reach simply didn't leave room for a human-sized figure to be anywhere that the hand wasn't going to be. Saitama watched the hand descend. He watched it with the calm, unhurried attention of someone watching something arrive that they have already decided how to respond to, and when it was close enough, when the geometry of the reach had reached the point where the next thing that happened was going to be contact, he stepped to the side, not the desperate lateral dive of someone barely escaping, but the minimal, economical sidestep of someone for whom the difference between where they were and where they needed to be was a small and easily covered distance. And the hand hit the ground where he had been standing, and the impact sent a shockwave through the terrain that the Allied forces felt in the soles of their feet from 3 kilometers away. He looked at the hand. Then he looked up at the founding titan, all the way up, tilting his head back at the same angle he had used for the wall titans, but further, considerably further, tracking upward along the skeletal form until he reached the part that contained whatever was directing all of this, the specific location that his instincts, honed by years of fighting things that had a controlling intelligence somewhere in their structure, identified as the part that mattered. He cracked his knuckles. The sound was very small in the context of everything around it. He looked up at the founding titan with an expression that was finally, unmistakably, something other than neutral. The expression of a person who has encountered something large enough to engage with something more than the surface layer of their attention, who has found, against the reliable odds of their experience. A problem that is at least interesting to look at even if it is not, and probably will not be. A problem that is genuinely difficult to solve. Okay, Saitama said, to the founding titan, to Eren, to the accumulated weight of a century of inherited suffering, and a plan that had required the death of most of humanity to implement, with the tone of someone who has decided to try, who has agreed to show up fully for the first time in longer than they can clearly remember. Let's see what you've got. Eren Yeager had seen the future. Not metaphorically, not in the way that strategists see the future by modeling probability and extrapolating from available data, but literally. He had accessed the memories of attacked titans, yet to come through the paths that connected every Eldian across time, had walked through the future the way you walk through a room, had seen the specific shape of how things were going to end, and had made his choices with that knowledge informing every step. Which meant that his choices had a quality that most people's choices didn't have, which was the quality of being made in the full knowledge of their cost, of choosing to do a thing while knowing exactly what the doing of it would require and what it would take from you, and what you would look like at the end of it to the people who had loved the version of you that existed before the choosing. He had seen Mikasa's grief. He had seen Armin's tears. He had seen the moment of his own death and had walked toward it anyway, and the walking toward it was supposed to be the point, the evidence of his commitment, the proof that he was not doing this for himself, that the boy who had wanted to see the ocean had genuinely, completely, without reservation been consumed by the thing the world had required him to become. What he had not seen, in any of the futures he had walked through, was this. The paths did not contain this. The attack titans inherited memories, which stretched forward through every holder of the power to the end of the line, had not included the image of a yellow figure moving through his wall titans with the casual efficiency of someone clearing a path through tall grass, had not included the crumpling of the beast titan's form under a single punch, had not included this moment, the founding titan's hand hitting empty ground, because the thing it was reaching for had simply stepped aside. Stepped aside the way you step around a puddle, without urgency, without drama, without any of the desperate expenditure of everything you have that stepping aside from the hand of the founding titan was supposed to require. This absence from the paths disturbed him more than the physical fact of it. The paths had shown him things that he would have preferred not to know, had forced on him a foreknowledge that had cost him every ordinary human experience of uncertainty and surprise, had turned the future into something he was moving through rather than toward, and he had made his peace with that cost because the alternative, operating without the knowledge, making choices in the dark like everyone else, felt like a luxury he couldn't afford when the stakes were what they were. But the paths had missed this. The inherited memories of every attack titan had not included a yellow figure stepping aside from the founding titan's reach, which meant either the paths were incomplete in a way he hadn't known, or this figure existed outside the logic that the paths operated within, outside the chain of causation that connected Eldian history across time and made the future something that could be seen at all. And both of those possibilities implied something about the nature of what he was dealing with that he did not have a framework to process quickly. He tried the scream. The founding titan's scream was the mechanism through which Eren exercised the coordinates' power over other titans and other Eldians, the frequency that bypassed individual will and reached directly into the biological and spiritual infrastructure of every body connected to the paths, and he directed it at Saitama with the specific intent that he had used to direct it at the wall titans. Not a general broadcast, but a targeted application. Reaching for whatever Eldian connection this figure might have, whatever thread in the paths might be accessible, whatever lever the coordinate could find and pull. The scream hit Saitama like a wave hits a cliff. It arrived, it made contact, and it did nothing, not because Saitama resisted it, but because there was nothing in him for it to find. No Eldian blood, no connection to the paths, no thread in the coordinates' vast network that led to or from or through the yellow figure standing in the rubble below him, and the coordinate reaching for that thread and finding nothing was like reaching into a space where a wall should be and finding only air. The specific disorientation of a hand expecting resistance and encountering absence. Saitama looked up at him. The founding titan's scream at close range was a physical event as well as a metaphysical one. It displaced air. It vibrated surfaces. It had an effect on the inner ear that most humans experienced as pain and disorientation. And Saitama experienced it as sound, loud sound. The kind that made you want to put your hands over your ears if you were the kind of person whose ears were affected by loud sound in any meaningful way, which Saitama was not. But the loudness registered as a data point, and the data point was that whatever this was, it was trying something different, which meant the previous things hadn't worked, which was information he already had but which was being confirmed in a new way. He jumped. The jump carried him upward along the skeletal structure of the founding titan, not toward the head directly, but toward the ribcage, the massive architecture of bone that surrounded the part of the form where Eren's actual body was located, the protected center of a structure that had been designed, or had evolved, or had been shaped by the power of the titans in whatever way such things were shaped, to make access to that center as difficult as possible. Surrounded by bone the diameter of buildings, and hardened by the specific biology of the founding titan's form, into something that the weapons of the world of attack on Titan had no reliable way of breaching quickly or cleanly. Saitama put his hand on one of the ribs and pushed. The rib moved. This was, in the context of everything that the world of attack on Titan understood about Titan biology and Titan structure, and the physical properties of hardened Titan bone, not something that was supposed to be possible through the direct application of human-scale physical force. And the rib's movement, slow, resistant, but continuous, bending under the pressure the way a green branch bends before it breaks. With the specific quality of resistance that comes from something very strong encountering something stronger, produced a sound that carried across the battlefield, and that everyone who heard it processed with the specific dissonance of hearing something that shouldn't be possible being accomplished in real time. Eren felt it. The founding titan's form was connected to his perception in a way that made damage to the form register as information even when it didn't register as pain in any ordinary sense. And the information that arrived as Saitama pushed the rib aside was the information of a barrier being removed, of a protection being accessed, of something reaching the interior of a structure that the structure's entire design was oriented around making inaccessible. And Eren responded the way he responded to everything that threatened his plan, with everything he had, immediately, without reservation. The founding titan's other hand came around and hit Saitama from the side with a force that contained every physical capability of the founding titan concentrated into a single strike. And the strike connected, and Saitama moved, not flew, not crumpled, not dissolved into the kind of result that a strike from the founding titan was supposed to produce, but moved, slid along the surface of the ribcage with his hand, still in contact with the rib he had been pushing, using the momentum of the strike to continue the movement he was already making rather than being interrupted by it, the specific judo principle of redirecting incoming force rather than opposing it, applied not through training or strategy, but through the simple physical fact that the force of the strike, while very large in absolute terms, was not large enough relative to Saitama to produce a result that was different from the result Saitama was already producing. The rib bent further. Then it broke, with a sound like a building coming apart, and the gap it left in the founding titan's ribcage was large enough for Saitama to move through, and he moved through it, into the interior of the form, toward the specific location where the coordinates connection to Eren's physical body was centered. And Eren, feeling the approach through the form's awareness, made a decision that he had not made at any previous point in the rumbling, which was to stop the wall titans. Not permanently, Not because he had changed his mind about the plan or about the logic that had produced it or about the necessity of what he was doing. The stop was tactical, a pause in the execution of the plan while he addressed a variable that the plan had not accounted for, with the intent of resuming once the variable was resolved. But the stop was real, and the wall titan stopped, and the sudden, vast, geologically significant cessation of millions of massive bodies that had been in continuous motion registered across the battlefield as a silence that was not actually silence. The world was still full of sound, wind, and the settling of disturbed earth and the engines of the Allied airships. But that felt like silence because the sound that had been underneath everything, the rhythmic impact of wall titan footsteps, had stopped. And the stopping of it was the most significant thing that had happened on this battlefield since the rumbling began. Mikasa felt it first. She felt it before she understood it, felt it as a change in the quality of the air and the ground under her feet, the specific physical signal of something very large that had been in motion no longer being in motion. And she looked at the wall titans nearest to her position, and they were still, genuinely still, not paused in the way that things pause when they encounter an obstacle, but still in the way that things are still when the instruction to move has been withdrawn. And she looked at Armin on the platform above her, and Armin was already looking at the founding titan, at the gap in the ribcage, at the yellow figure visible inside the form moving toward its center, with an expression that she recognized as the expression he wore when something had happened that he hadn't planned for, and was now very rapidly trying to incorporate into a plan that could still work. He stopped the rumbling, Armin said, and his voice had the quality of someone reporting something they are still, in some portion of their processing, refusing to fully believe. Eren stopped the rumbling. To deal with, he gestured at the founding titan, at the gap in the ribcage, at the yellow figure inside it, to deal with that. Ryuner, in his armored titan form, had stopped moving when the wall titan stopped, had stood in the sudden stillness of a battlefield where the defining constant had been removed, and was trying to recalibrate around the absence of it. And he looked at the founding titan, and he understood what he was looking at in the way that soldiers understand things. Not analytically, not with the full constructed comprehension of someone who has had time to think it through, but with the gut-level recognition of someone who has spent years learning to read a battlefield and who can see, in the positioning and the movement and the sequence of events, the shape of what is happening even without knowing all the specific details of why. What was happening was that Eren had stopped the single most catastrophic military action in the history of human civilization to address a problem that a single person in a yellow jumpsuit was causing inside his Titan form. And the stopping of the rumbling was not a victory for the Allied forces in any sense that they had earned or planned or could claim credit for. It was a side effect. A consequence of a confrontation between two things that existed outside the logic of the world the Allied forces were fighting in, and the Allied forces were experiencing the benefit of it, the way bystanders experience the benefit of two larger forces accidentally resolving a problem while engaged with each other, which is gratefully, and with the specific discomfort of knowing that the resolution has nothing to do with anything you did. Inside the founding Titan, in the space between Eren's perception and Eren's physical form, Saitama moved through the architecture of the most powerful being in the history of this world. And Eren, for the first time in a journey that had taken him from the burning streets of Shiganshina through the basement, and the ocean and the war and the paths to this moment, experienced something that the future he had walked through had not prepared him for, and that his plan had not included a response to, which was the simple, absolute, completely unambiguous physical fact of being unable to stop what was coming toward him. And the experience of that fact was not what he had expected, was not the clarifying confirmation of his own resolve that every previous obstacle had eventually become, but something quieter and more destabilizing, something that reached past the years of accumulated conviction and touched something much older and much simpler. The thing underneath all the ideology and all the sacrifice and all the certainty, which was a boy who had wanted freedom and had converted that want, through a decade of loss and rage and grief, into something so large and so absolute that it had consumed the boy completely, and the consuming had felt like becoming. But in this moment, with something moving toward him that his plan could not stop, and his power could not redirect and his foreknowledge had not shown him, it felt, for the first time in a very long time, like loss. Saitama reached the center of the form. He looked at Eren's physical body, suspended in the coordinate, surrounded by the paths and the connection and the vast spiritual infrastructure of the founding Titan's power, and he looked at it with the same open, uncomplicated attention he brought to everything. And Eren looked back at him, and for a moment, just a moment, the space of a breath, neither of them did anything. And in that moment, the rumbling was stopped, and the world was quiet, and everything that had led to this point hung in the air between them like a question that hadn't been asked yet. "You started all of this?" Saitama asked, gesturing vaguely at the stopped wall titans, at the flattened ruins, at the general shape of the catastrophe visible through the gaps in the founding Titan's ribcage. Eren looked at him. "Yes," he said, and the word came out with all of its weight, with every layer of what yes meant in this context, the grief and the conviction and the exhaustion and the grief again, because the grief was always there, underneath everything, the thing the plan was built on top of that the plan had never actually resolved. Saitama nodded slowly. "That's a lot," he said, and then, with the specific gentle directness of someone who has no investment in making the truth more comfortable than it is, but also no investment in making it crueler, he said, "You look really tired." And Eren Yeager, who had carried the weight of the world's ending on his back for years, who had made himself into a monster so that the people he loved could be heroes, who had seen the future and walked into it with his eyes open and his grief intact and his conviction unbroken until this moment. Eren Yeager had no response to that, because it was true, and it was the truest thing anyone had said to him in longer than he could clearly remember. And the truth of it hit him in a place that the founding Titan's power and the coordinate and the paths and all the certainty he had built around himself had not been able to fully armor over. The moment after a war ends is always stranger than the war itself, because the war, however terrible, has a structure. It has sides and objectives and the specific organizing logic of conflict, which tells everyone present what they are supposed to be doing and in what direction they are supposed to be doing it. And that structure, however brutal, is a kind of clarity, and clarity, however painful, is easier to inhabit than its absence. The moment the structure dissolves, when the objectives are achieved or abandoned or rendered irrelevant by something outside the war's own logic, what remains is a silence that nobody has a map for, a stillness that the people standing in it have no prepared response to, because their preparation was all oriented toward the continuation of the thing that has just stopped. And the stopping of it leaves them in a space that feels less like peace than like the sudden removal of a very loud and very constant sound that you had stopped registering as sound, and had started registering as the baseline condition of existence. And the removal of it is disorienting in a way that takes time to resolve into anything that can be called relief. That was the silence that settled over the world of attack on Titan in the minutes after Saitama reached the center of the founding Titan's form, and the rumbling stopped. Not the tactical pause that Eren had imposed to address the variable, but a complete and final stopping, the wall titans going still everywhere simultaneously in the specific way that things go still when the instruction animating them has been withdrawn permanently rather than temporarily, falling into themselves in the slow, structural way of things that were never really alive, losing even the borrowed animation that had made them move, the ground shaking for kilometers in every direction as millions of massive bodies settled into the earth they had been walking on, the sound of the settling carrying across what remained of the Marleyan coast like the last statement of something that had been speaking very loudly for several days and had run out of things to say. What Saitama had done inside the founding Titan was not dramatic, in the way that the resolution of something this significant was supposed to be dramatic. There was no extended confrontation, no philosophical debate that lasted long enough to become its own arc, no moment where Eren made a choice that redeemed or condemned him in terms that the narrative could use to close the loop of his story cleanly. What happened was simpler, and in its simplicity more complete than any of those things, which was that Saitama looked at Eren in the space of the coordinate, in the strange spiritual architecture of the paths where the founding Titan's power lived, and he saw what was there. Not the ideology, not the plan, not the founding Titan or the attack Titan or the coordinate, or the weight of Ymir's curse, or any of the accumulated metaphysical infrastructure of a century of Titan history. But the person underneath all of that, the boy who had wanted to be free in a simple and direct sense and had converted that want into something so large and so consuming that the boy had been lost inside it, and he reached into the coordinate with the same uncomplicated directness he brought to everything, and he took the founding Titan's power apart the way you take apart something that has been assembled incorrectly, not with malice, not with ceremony, but with the patient, practical attention of someone who can see how the pieces fit together and can therefore see how they come apart, and the power of the founding Titan, the coordinate, the connection to every Eldian body and every Titan form and every thread in the paths. All of it unraveled under a touch that it had no capacity to resist, because it had been designed to resist everything that the world it existed in could produce. And Saitama was not something that world had produced. Ren felt the power leave. Not painfully, that was the thing that surprised him, that the ending of something he had spent years becoming and years wielding and years wrapping his entire identity around was not painful, was not the agony of amputation that he might have expected, but something closer to the feeling of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long that you stopped registering the weight, and only notice it now in the specific quality of the lightness that follows the putting down. He felt his connection to the wall Titans dissolve, felt the coordinate go quiet the way a room goes quiet when a sound you hadn't consciously registered stops, felt the paths close around him not like walls but like curtains, the vast spiritual network of Eldian connection still present in the world but no longer accessible to him, no longer something he was the center of, no longer a burden he was required to carry or a weapon he was required to point at anything. He was just a person. In a way that he had not been just a person in a very long time, perhaps since before the basement, perhaps since before Shiganshina, perhaps since a moment so early in his life that he could not locate it precisely in memory. He was just a person, standing in the ruins of the most ambitious and most terrible thing he had ever done, without the power to continue it, and without the certainty that had made the continuing of it feel necessary. And the feeling of that was not what he had expected, was not the defeat or the relief or the grief he might have anticipated, but something quieter and more uncertain, the feeling of someone who has been in a very loud place for a very long time, stepping into a room where the acoustics are different and needing a moment before they can hear anything clearly. Saitama stepped back out through the gap in the ribcage and dropped to the ground below, landing in the rubble with the small impact crater he always made and the cape flutter that always accompanied it, and he looked around at the stillness that had replaced the rumbling. The stopped wall Titans settling into the earth, the allied airships hovering in the suddenly quiet sky, the surviving soldiers and Titan shifters standing in the landscape of what the rumbling had made of the Marleyan coast before it stopped. And he looked at all of it with the expression of someone who has completed a task and is checking whether the completion is satisfactory before moving on. Armin descended to ground level. He had been watching the founding Titan from the airship, had watched the gap appear in the ribcage, had watched the wall Titan stop, had watched the founding Titan itself begin to come apart in the slow, structural way that Titan forms came apart when the shifter inside them was no longer maintaining the transformation, the massive skeletal body dissolving at the edges, and then more completely inward, the coordinate's physical manifestation unmaking itself in the absence of the power that had made it. and he had processed all of it with the careful, layered attention he brought to things that were changing the shape of the world in real time. And now, he stood in front of Saitama in the rubble of a Marlian city, with the specific expression of a person who has prepared extensively for a conversation, and has just realized that none of the preparation applies. He didn't know what to say. This was unusual for Armin, who generally knew what to say even in situations that other people found unsayable, who had built his usefulness on the ability to find language for things that resisted it. And the fact that he was standing in front of this yellow-clad figure with the rumbling stopped, and the founding titan dissolved, and Eren, somewhere in the rubble behind him, just a person now, and not knowing what to say was itself a kind of information about what had just happened. About the scale of it, and the nature of it, and the way it exceeded every category he had prepared language for. "You stopped it," he finally said, and the words came out with a simplicity that was less eloquence than the honest product of a mind that had run out of more complex options. "The rumbling. You stopped it." "Yeah," Saitama said. And then, because this apparently required clarification or because the clarification felt relevant to him for reasons of his own, he added, "The big skeleton thing was doing it. I took the glow-eye part out." He considered this description for a moment, apparently checking it for accuracy, and seemed satisfied with it as a summary. Armin looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the stopped wall titans, at the settled rubble, at the sky above what remained of the Marlian coast, which was the sky of a world that was still mostly intact, that still had most of its people in it, that had come closer to ending than it had ever come before and had not ended, and the not ending of it was sitting in his chest in a way that hadn't resolved into a feeling yet, that was still in the stage of being information rather than experience. The gap between knowing something and feeling it that always existed, and that sometimes, in the biggest moments, stretched into a distance that took days or weeks to cross. Mikasa had found Eren in the rubble. She had moved toward the dissolving founding titan the moment it began to come apart, with the specific directional certainty of someone who has been moving toward Eren Yeager their entire life, and has not stopped knowing which direction he is in regardless of what form he is currently taking or what he has become in the interval since they were last in the same place. And she found him in the settling remains of the Titan's form. Just a person, sitting in the rubble. Looking at his hands with the expression of someone reacquainting themselves with the specific dimensions and capabilities of a body that has been a vessel for something much larger for so long that the ordinary scale of it feels unfamiliar. She sat down next to him. She didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that the sitting next to him didn't say more directly, and Eren looked at her with the expression of someone who has been away for a very long time and is trying to determine whether the person in front of them is exactly as they remembered or whether the away has changed the remembering. And the looking lasted long enough that it crossed the boundary from assessment into something more like simply looking. The activity of being present with a person rather than evaluating them, which was something Eren had not done in a very long time with anyone. Reiner, in his human form now, sat in the rubble at a distance that was respectful without being absent, the distance of someone who understood that he was not the right person for the center of this moment, but who was also not going anywhere, because going somewhere would have required a destination, and he didn't have one yet. He looked at what remained of the Marlian coast, and he looked at the stopped wall titans, and he thought about the years that had brought him here and the cost of those years, and the specific quality of being alive at the end of something that had not been designed with survival as one of its parameters. And he didn't try to resolve any of it into meaning, yet because the meaning would come or it wouldn't, and either way it was a project for later. When the information had become experience, and the experience had been carried long enough to become something you could think about rather than just something you were inside. Saitama, across the rubble, had found a piece of wall that was the right height to sit on and had sat on it, and he was looking at the sky above the Marlian coast with the patient, unhurried attention of someone with nowhere to be and nothing pressing to do, which was the condition of his existence that he had not chosen and could not change, and had been living inside for long enough that he had stopped expecting it to feel different than it did, which was like sitting in a room after the party has ended. Not sad exactly, but aware of the absence of something that had briefly, almost, been present. The sky above the Marleyan coast was extraordinary, not as extraordinary as the sky above Titan, which had the suspended debris of a shattered moon to work with, but extraordinary in the more ordinary way of skis above places where large things have recently happened, carrying the atmospheric aftermath of the rumbling and the quality of the light, the dust, and the displaced air producing colors at the horizon that didn't appear in skis above places that hadn't been through what this sky had been through. The specific beauty of aftermath that exists in the space between catastrophe and whatever comes after it. He looked at it for a while, and in the looking there was something that was not quite the feeling he had been waiting for, not the rush of genuine engagement that he had stopped expecting to find and kept not quite finding anyway, but something adjacent to it, something in the same neighborhood, the quiet, temporary, almost accidental sensation of having been present for something that mattered, of having been in a place where things were at stake and people were afraid and the stakes were real, and of having done something about it. Not because it thrilled him or challenged him or gave him back what he had lost in the training, but because the people needed help and he had been there, and help had been what was required. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But it was something, and something was what he had, and he had learned, slowly and without fully accepting it, to sit with something rather than refusing it because it wasn't everything. The crack in reality opened behind him after a while, the same quiet discontinuity that had deposited him here, the universe reasserting its boundaries and offering him a way back to his own, and he stood up from the piece of wall and looked back once at the battlefield. At the stopped Titans, and the airships and the small figures of people beginning the long process of understanding what had just happened, and what came next, and whether next was something they could build toward, or whether the damage was too complete for building to be the right metaphor. Armin saw him go. He watched the yellow figure walk toward the shimmer in the air, and step through it with the same unhurried, slightly meandering pace it had arrived with, and he watched the shimmer close behind it, and he stood in the rubble of the Marleyan coast in the sudden absence of it, and felt the specific quality of owing something to a thing you cannot repay, and cannot find and cannot even properly name. Because the thing had arrived without introduction and left without farewell, and had never indicated that it wanted anything in return for what it had done, had never indicated that what it had done was, from its perspective, anything more than a thing that had seemed like the appropriate response to a situation it had found itself in. He looked at the stopped Titans. He looked at the sky. He looked at the place where the shimmer had been and was no longer. "What do we do now?" Jean asked from somewhere behind him, and the question was practical and immediate and exactly the right question for the moment they were in, the question that had to be asked before any of the larger questions could be approached, and Armin turned toward it with the full weight of his attention because this, the next thing, the practical thing, the thing that could be done was where he lived, was the territory he knew, was the work that remained after the thing that was supposed to be impossible had been done by something that hadn't known it was impossible, and therefore hadn't been stopped by knowing it. "We start with what's here," Armin said. "We start with the people who are still alive and the ground that's still standing, and the fact that the rumbling stopped." He looked at the horizon, at the Marleyan coast that had been partially flattened and had not been fully flattened, at the distance between what had almost happened and what had actually happened, a distance measured in millions of lives that were still being lived somewhere beyond that horizon. That's enough to start with. That's more than enough. Somewhere on the other side of a crack that had already sealed itself, Saitama walked home through streets that could challenge him in no way that mattered and past people who had no idea what he was, and arrived at his apartment, and took off his cape. Nodding the scorch mark from the previous adventure, was now accompanied by a new tear from where the founding Titan's ribcage had caught it. and he put it on the chair he kept it on, and he made dinner and he ate it, and he sat on his couch and he waited. With the vast and patient and quietly exhausted equanimity of someone who has learned that the waiting is what the life is, for the next thing that would almost feel like something. Outside his window, the city continued its ordinary, mortal, beautiful business of being alive, full of problems sized for humans, full of stakes that could be felt, full of everything that he protected and could not join, the world going on as it always went on, unaware and unhurt and exactly as it had always been. And Saitama sat in the quiet center of his own immovable, unreachable, unbearable strength, and he waited. And the waiting was the whole of it. And he had stopped expecting it to become something else, and the not expecting was the closest thing to peace that being Saitama allowed, and he held it carefully, the way you hold something small and fragile that you know will not last but that is, for the moment, real.